the quality of what we're going to be discussing. So let's get to it. I think first and foremost, in order for us to really get started on this conversation, on this topic about the immigrant rights movement and the future of this movement, it's important that we center ourselves and the way in which we come to this space. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen with you all. And please let me know if you have any issues viewing any of this material. Alrighty. So this is me. I know. Oh, what a cute kid. Wow. And she's still cute today. Yes, absolutely. I try. I do the best that I can. So this is me. When I was in Belize, I was born in Belize, Central America, a super small country that borders Guatemala and Mexico. But oftentimes when we have conversations about who immigration impacts and where Central America is and who we center as being from that region, we tend not to think of people like myself. Right? Belize is a small country of less than 500,000 people. So whenever you have conversations in Central America is brought up, we tend to talk about Mexico, we tend to talk about Guatemala, El Salvador, but we never bring up Belize. And the reason why that is, in my opinion, is due in large part to the fact that Belize is one of the only English-speaking countries in Central America, right? And so when we think of who is identified as Latinx, Afro-Latinx, right? We tend to think that individuals who are Latinx must only speak Spanish, right? When in fact that we know that Spanish isn't the sole marker for who is considered a part of Latinx identity. And so that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason, and I think this might be the overarching reason, is due to anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness, which wants to prevent us from looking at this issue, immigration, in a very comprehensive manner. So we can see that it's not just Latinx folks, but it's Black folk. It's folk who are coming from the continent. It's individuals who are coming from places like Mexico and Honduras and are the same complexion as me, if not darker, like the Mexican census revealed a few years back, where we saw more than 3 million Afro-Latinx folks who are on the ground in Mexico. Those are conversations we do not have enough. And so for me, my journey was a bit different, right? Whenever we have conversations about immigration, we talk about the border and we talk about folks who are migrating and trekking that way. However, for many of us, we do not have the ability to simply just walk across the border, right? And so because of how far we are away from the US-Mexico border, our journey tends to be a bit different. And that's why I included my passport photo, right? So that when we talk about how folks even come to be in this country in the first place, that we often talk about it migratory by just being by foot or by boat, when in fact, many Black migrants do not have the same ability to do that. And so the ways that we tend to become undocumented is by way of our visas expiring, right? And then not having the ability to eventually apply for a pathway because of the lack of pathways to citizenship. You often hear a lot of folks say the same thing, right? They will tell us, get to the back of the line. What line? Like, I'm waiting. If that line existed, many of us would be there with bells and whistles, okay? It simply does not exist. And so for me, the reason that I am who I am is in large part, right, if not completely. And I say in large part because I still believe in the Most High, honey, but in large part due to my grandmother. And in her late 60s, my grandmother made the decision to raise me after raising 7 children as a single mother. Like, how many people would have done that? I know I would have been like, you know, that's sad and all, but I don't know. But she made that decision in her late 60s to raise me. And if not for that opportunity, I cannot say that I would be before you today. So I give the vast majority of credit for where I am, who I am, to my grandmother. And so for me, my journey was a little bit different. Like I mentioned, it didn't just have to do with the migratory process. It also had to be with my coming out story. We often say when an immigrant reveals their full identity, we describe that as coming out of the shadows, right? And so for me, it took a little bit longer. And the reason that it took a bit longer was because many people who looked at me, unfortunately, due to the stereotypical notions that we have of immigrants and what an immigrant looks like, I never felt the need to share because no one looked at me and said, she's an immigrant. Everybody looked at me, and because I was from the only English speaking country in Central America, and I could speak, English in a manner where it was easily decipherable, it took longer. It wasn't until my junior year of high school that my college counselor said to me, if we don't know, we can't help you. Right. And that's because for the first time, being a Californian resident, right, a California resident, where we often have access to the most opportunities and the roadblocks are not the same as for the people who are living in southern states. And so I was in a bubble for so long. And then the college application process started. Right. And it's a struggle for anyone. The college application process is a struggle even for US citizens and individuals who are privileged to have citizenship. So you can only imagine what that means for someone who is sin papeles, right? It is an additional burden and struggle. And a lot of the resources that we see today in regards to DACA, right, and who has what temporary protected status, and additional resources like DED were things that simply did not exist back then in the way that it does, right? I remember in my first year at UCLA going into the housing department after being accepted and them saying, okay, no problem, you've been admitted. Can you give us your social security number? And I was like, what had happened was it's not as accessible as it is now. Back then, folks had to be under the covers, had to muffle their voices, and couldn't really speak out in a way in which other people would know about their status. But then, one of the catalysts for me was realizing that I truly was not alone in my experiences as an undocumented and Black woman. In fact, the high school that I was a part of, knowing that I had gotten accepted to UCLA, said, hey, we actually have an alumna who graduated from our same high school system because it was a charter school, and she's now at UCLA. And not just that, she's also a Black woman from Belize. Like, what are the odds that of a small country of 500,000 that the same high school system that I went to would be able to connect me to another undocumented and Black woman at the time and allow me to really pick her mind and see how she navigated such a complex education system. And so that was the catalyst for me. And it was also the fact that I knew if I didn't speak up, if I didn't say that I'm undocumented and Black and a woman navigating higher education, who would help me? Who would talk about the intersections of these issues in the way that I would? And it's one thing to be undocumented and Black. It's a whole other thing to be undocumented and Black from Belize. Okay, there's like a handful of us. So we really have to show up and show out how we can. And so that really sparked something in me, right? It made me realize that the individuals in positions of power that we've always held to a higher standard aren't, in fact, the only educated people on these topics, that it's the individuals with lived experiences who really have the ability to move the needle, right? That it's us who are in positions of power to create change. And so that led me to Undocu-Black. And so let me give a little brief overview of how this came to be. And now I could look back and laugh, but I think back then you would probably say, what were you thinking? You could have been kidnapped. Oh my goodness. So I first met individuals from the Undocu-Black network at the Movement for Black Lives convening in Cleveland, Ohio, the first ever. And so I was in a group where I was talking about the intersections of Blackness and immigration, and other individuals in the room said, oh, we have this brand new organization. We're actually looking to create a convening where we bring together Black immigrants from all across the nation. Would you be interested? Okay, sounds regular enough, does not seem to raise any red flags. You see that trend going around about red flags and things that's trending. Yeah, so that wasn't any red flags raised at that moment. However, they had told me that we would go ahead and book you a ticket. All you would know is that you were going to be arriving in Miami, but we could not tell you who was picking you up, nor could we tell you what hotel you were staying at or what exact region of Miami you would be. Red flag, okay? But I think that just goes to show the level. And like I said, now I could laugh about it. But back then, the reason that such safety precautions had to be taken, right, is because of the real credible threat and fear that Black migrants and undocumented people have in this country, right? That we have to take such safety measures just to make sure that we are able to continue to live our lives and survive, not even thrive, but survive. Thus, the reason why it included this image. This image is the image that we took at the very end of the convening in Miami, Florida. And the reason why everybody's backs are turned is, like I said, due to the real threat and the real credible fear that immigrants face in this country, and a fear of not wanting to be recognized even by their employers or by their friends who did not want to know their status. Even something like that for me was foreign. I had never once, as a Californian, thought that I have to turn my face away from a camera due to the fear. That speaks that even while we are marginalized by the same issue, there's still some privileges that exist, right? And we have to be real about that. So this brings me to the first issue of Black migrant and immigrant erasure. On the left, when we saw the migrant caravan take place, the image on the left is what we saw. We never really paid attention, nor did we get sufficient media coverage of the fact that it was mostly individuals coming from Haiti and the African continent on the right. And it's unfortunate because we saw the same thing happen with family separation, where we saw these tragic images on the left-hand side. But what we did not mention was that the first case of family separation in this nation was actually a Cameroonian mother and her 7-year-old daughter. But immediately when the conversation started, we did not hear that. Did you all know that the first case of family separation was a Cameroonian woman? And I bet not, because no one really interrogated and had these conversations in that way. And in fact, it was that Cameroonian mother that provided the basis for the ACLU to fight the Trump administration. Exactly, this is huge, right? I'm seeing it resonate with folk, and this is huge. It was that Cameroonian mother and her daughter's case of family separation that served as the basis for the ACLU to push back against the Trump administration and their discriminatory and problematic and xenophobic family separation policy, right? And on the right-hand side, what we see, and I really, if you all, I'm not giving you homework or anything, but I'm just making a little recommendation, all right? That if you could really take time to look at the letter on the right, and I know you can barely see it, it's very small, but if you just search a cry for help, Cameroonian women at the T. Don Hutto detention facility, you'll be able to read it because there's an organization that wrote it out word by word and you'll be able to see. But just to provide a synopsis, the letter was written by almost 400 Cameroonian women being held in detention. And in this letter, these women go on to detail the very horrific treatment that they had to incur at the hands of individuals who were detention officers in the T-Don Huddle facility. And they literally say, if there's any doubt in your mind that immigration is a Black issue, then I need you to take into consideration what was written by these women. And in it, they literally say that individuals ignored them when they sought medical attention, right? They said that there were individuals who were coming of other races and ethnicities who were brought into detention after them, but were released before them. They also mentioned that each time that they said that they had a health problem, a health disparity, that they were told that they're exaggerated, that their pain is not what they think. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like the modern day medical racism that many individuals of color and a part of poor and impoverished communities have to face, right? So none of this is new. These things have been happening and they continue to happen. So really quickly, I want to do a little check. How many of you knew the real origins of our modern day immigration system? How many of you knew that the immigration system that we now know of was actually created as a result of efforts by the KKK? I don't know how many of you all knew that.
Wait, the KKK is part of this?
The KKK was a part of the origins of this nation's Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924. If you're wondering literally what is the connection, okay, because I know a lot of people might be like, wait a minute, I thought the KKK was just for Black Americans. Yes, but remember, the KKK wanted to prioritize individuals who were considered to be Aryan, right? Blonde hair, blue eyes. And so, of course, that had to do with the individuals on the ground, but then it would also have to do with any potential individuals immigrating to this country, right? And so at a certain point in this nation's history, the KKK had membership well into the millions who were dues paying members in this country. And as a result, they actually helped to elect individuals into our Congress, into the Senate, into the House of Representatives, and as governors in various states. So when we look at the time in which the Immigration and Nationality had passed of 1924 had passed in the 1920s, they had successfully elected more than 17 senators, gotten more than 60 representatives, and almost 15 governors across the nation. And so as a result of their lobbying efforts, they were able to successfully pass the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924, which led to the creation of this nation's immigration quota system. And so that might not seem like a major issue, right? Because quotas exist today as well too. But the problem with that is when your so-and-so quota is actually meant to favor individuals who are coming from Northern European countries, meaning white individuals of Germanic backgrounds, nobody who is, Black, no one who's a person of color. It was a clear prioritization of individuals who were white. The reason that that's relevant is because oftentimes when we think about segregation and segregatory policies, we say, oh, that just had to do with whites only and colored only. But if you look at this image of one of the segregation signs from during segregation, this actually doesn't just mention Black people. It says no dogs, no Negroes, and no Mexicans. So whenever we attempt to make a clear line and say that's not our issue, that's on y'all, then please remember that the formulation of white supremacy in this country was, yes, against Native and Indigenous people, was against Black people who built this nation to be where it is, but it also was a clear discrimination against anyone who wasn't white. Just remember that, right? Because I think, unfortunately, the way that we look at things right now, we want to separate our issues. right? And we want to make it seem as though our liberation isn't bound to one another, when in fact, it is. That when we work to be anti-racist, it means to be active allies, right? It means to stand up for communities that aren't your own. And so I often get this question. This is, believe it or not, one of the top questions that I get. And this question is absurd, and it might be to those of you who are on this Zoom today as well too. But the question is that I often get asked, what has Black people ever done for immigrants? I get that, believe it or not, a lot. And it is baffling that I'm still getting that in 2021, right? But I think that speaks to the erasure, the continual erasure that we continue to see of Black and AAPI immigrants as well too, because this has to do with members of the AAPI community as well, right? Because when we talk about any group and we prioritize not just people of Latinx identity, but specifically individuals coming from Mexico, there's an erasure of anyone else who doesn't fit and meet that marker. And so the civil rights movement, for anyone who doubts what Black people have ever done for immigrant rights, we have to think about the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was due to those crucial pieces of legislation that we were able to get rid of the race-based quota system in immigration. Meaning that for the first time since the passage of the 1924 Immigration and Nationality Act, we would actually open up the doors for other individuals who are not coming from Northern European Germanic countries to be issued a visa. That is significant. And that wouldn't have happened if not for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So why is this relevant to today, right? Because I think that's the key. When we talk about these issues, we have to bring it back. And a lot of people would look at this sign and they say, well, you know, this is outdated. This happened so long ago during the 1900s. And because it happened during the 1900s, it has no bearing on modern life. But yet we see images like this, right? In 2021, which evokes to me images of slave patrols that were hired to capture enslaved people, right? So is it really irrelevant? Is it really not pertinent? And so in order for us to understand this image, I think we must also understand why is it, and I think this was a question that Daniela posed to me too when we were trying to figure out what this conversation would be about, is that we often see what is happening right now, but a lot of people do not pick up on the significance of how it came to be. This didn't happen overnight. What we're witnessing is not the first time that we've seen, maybe via images, right? Maybe publicly, maybe captured via video and in photographs in real time. But the reality is that this started in the 1970s and the 1980s. And in fact, long before that, when members of the Haitian country gained their independence, and didn't just gain their independence, fought for their independence. And one of the questions that Daniela had asked in our conversation was, why is it that when we look at what's taken place in Afghanistan, and the amount of individuals that we now see seeking a refuge in this country, that we see such a difference and such a distinction in regard to members of the Haitian community? I don't know how many of you have asked yourself this question, but I know I found myself having these conversations a lot, where of course, members of the Afghan community are deserving. There's no question. There's no question, right? That it's in large part due to the contributions of the Afghan people that the US was able to do what they did, and through the translators and through the individuals who were interpreting and doing different things, that they have deserved the ability to thrive in another country and to have peace, and women and girls shouldn't be suffering. That's clear. But why is it that we're so readily able to let in almost 500,000 more Afghans, but 14,000 Haitians in Del Rio, Texas is a problem. Have you stopped to ask yourself why that is? And so I'll talk about that. So actually in 1972, we saw the Haitian people start to flee, and they called them the Haitian boat people. So at that time in the 1970s, they were actually fleeing a dictator, right? And you could look it up and look up what his regime did. So basically, at that time, when we saw members of the Haitian community flee their dictator regime that was currently, ruling in Haiti, the US started to immediately qualify them as economic migrants instead of refugees. So what does that mean when someone gets marked as an economic migrant? It means that you no longer have access to the opportunities that refugee status would provide you, as far as being able to remain in the country, joining your family or friends that you have on the ground, right? And being able to start a life for yourself, because it will then put you on a pathway to eventual citizenship. Economic migrant status does not do that, right? Nor does it afford you the ability to remain in the United States without any sort of ramifications. And so what that meant was that it made members of the Haitian community literally ineligible to remain in the country. And at that time in the 1970s, it was the same numbers as we're talking about today. There were 15,000 Haitians when we did the largest count. It was 15,000 Haitians on the ground in Del Rio. It was the same thing in 1970s, in the 1972 in particular. Then what we saw was a Caribbean refugee crisis. Now, the difference between that and what took place in 1972 was that in the 1980s, in regard to the Caribbean refugee crisis, we saw 15,000 Haitians and we saw almost 100,000 Cubans. What was the difference? What was the difference? Members of the Haitian community were immediately imprisoned, jailed, and placed in prisons indefinitely, meaning without the possibility to get bond or to be released to their families and friends that they had on the ground. The US government made the argument that Cubanos had family and had friends and had established business relationships and ties, and as a result would be more suitable for refugee status, right? And so members of the Haitian community weren't able to get out of detention, or they were detained for extended periods of time. So let's talk about right now, right? There is a literal anti-Black immigration system that we face. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, right? These are facts. These are facts that have been confirmed by Raíces, the lawyers at Raíces, the lawyers at Al Otro Lado, that speaks to the clear disparities that we see in regard to who is impacted by our immigration system, or the lack thereof, okay? The lack thereof, I think, would be the better sense to describe this. So literally, Black immigrants face the longest periods of ICE incarceration. They're placed in solitary confinement, which, based on the studies and the research that we've seen come out of prisons about solitary confinement, then we know about the long-term ramifications that it could have to a person's physical and mental health. So Black migrants are 6 times more likely to be placed in solitary confinement. Beyond that, when we look at the bond amounts that are expected to be paid, mind you, these bond amounts are already ridiculously priced, $10,000, $11,000. However, when we look at the amounts of how much members of the Black community have been hit with, it's been $15,000, $16,000 bond amounts. So it's literally 54% higher than other communities. And so when we look at members of the Haitian community, it's no surprise that we see images like this, because this has been what has been happening, like I said, that we know of since the 1970s, for sure during the 1980s, where we saw the refugee crisis between the Cubans and the Haitians. And now you have Haitians as the top individuals who are rejected from asylum in this country. And before it was members of the Haitian community, it was members of the Jamaican community. So there's a clear pattern, right? There's a clear pattern as to who we do not see as deserving. So let's talk about the reasons why, right? Why is it? Because this is what we get a lot of, right? If you've ever turned on Fox News for 2.5 seconds, I don't recommend it, but if you've even turned it on for 2.5 seconds to listen to conversations about migration, in particular, the issues around Black migration and understanding what is taking place in this nation, you'll see that the number one thing you'll hear, more conservative, xenophobic individuals say is, why don't they go back to where they come from, right? Like that's a top talking point, okay? And so here are the top reasons as to why we see Black migrants migrating in the first place. So when we look at Cameroon, they've literally been dealing with a 5-year crisis. 5-year conflict. When we look at Jamaica, we have members of the LGBTQIA community who are still susceptible to being stoned, right, for simply being who they are and who they were born to be. In Mauritania, we see the same thing where there's legalized slavery still on the books. Haiti, of course, we know that's as a result of a natural disaster in 2010, right, in which we saw the Red Cross raise several hundreds of millions of dollars and only built a handful of homes, right, for members of the Haitian community. And on top of that, we more recently saw the assassination of the Haitian president Moise. But yet, under the previous twice impeached president and his administration, he wanted to get rid of Haitian temporary protected status. And he wanted to get rid of it because he said that there's no longer a need for it. So wait a minute. Okay. In that same breath, he also said that Haitians and people from the continent are coming from blank hole countries. Y'all remember that, right? Y'all remember that conversation and how widely circulated it was. So which one is it? Is it that Haitians are no longer in need of TPS, right? Or is it that they're coming from blank hole countries? Because if the argument is that they're coming from blank hole countries, would that not make them more deserving of TPS, right? So there is no consistency, but the xenophobia is consistent and the anti-Blackness is consistent. So let's talk about right now. What is happening right now when we have conversations about immigration? How many people even know who this is? And you could just put something in the comments if you know who this is. Does anyone want to take themselves off of mute? Okay, yes. Oh, I thought so. Okay, so do you all know who that is? I feel like someone knows. I'm seeing nods. Okay. All righty. So this is the Senate parliamentarian. And I know everybody's like, who is she? We don't know her. She doesn't even go here. Okay. Because that's how I was. Because whenever we saw conversations taking place about the reconciliation package, we saw her name come up. Right? But who is she? Why is she significant to the fact that we do not get to have immigration included in the budget reconciliation simply because of her? Okay, and her name is Elizabeth McDonough. And I suggest you start looking into her because unfortunately, this woman wields a lot of power, right? Power that she used even to stop the passage of a federal minimum wage. Problematic. And so what we saw with the budget reconciliation, maybe for anyone who hasn't been paying attention, this is a $3.5 million budgetary process. This is a combination of everything, every issue, every prioritization that the Biden administration wants to have for this country. And so what they wanted to do, what members of the Democratic Party wanted to do, was to include a pathway to citizenship. A pathway to citizenship for four essential groups of people: members of the DACA community, members of the essential worker community who were undocumented, TPS workers, and farm workers. And what we saw in 2020, if that didn't tell us everything that we needed to know about the importance of immigrants and migrants in this country, then I don't know what it will take, right? It was literally the farm workers and the essential workers, not the CEOs of these multi-billion-dollar and trillion-dollar companies, that was actually keeping this nation afloat. Right? It was the farm workers who were going in, at least in California, to the Central Valley and doing this work day in and day out, in fire, in rain, whatever conditions, and making sure that we had the food that we need in order to continue to live and work from home, a privilege in which many people did not have. So, unfortunately, what we saw on September 19th was that the Senate parliamentarian, and I'm going to keep on reverting back to her photo because we need to know this Karen, okay? We need to know this Karen, because unfortunately, we continue to look, and this isn't to say that we shouldn't be holding Biden accountable. We shouldn't be holding Kamala Harris accountable. We shouldn't be holding Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. All of these individuals need to be held accountable, but we know about them, okay? They're already on our receipts list. I'm just adding another person, Elizabeth McDonough, aka the Senate Karen, so that you all can ensure that we hold her accountable as well too. So literally on September 19th, she ruled against including immigration reform in this bill. And the reason that she claimed she ruled against it was because she felt as though this was too far-reaching, meaning that it was too comprehensive of a bill in order to be included in the reconciliation package. Okay, so wait a minute. We haven't had a pathway to citizenship since Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. How is it that including DACA recipients, essential workers, farm workers, and TPS recipients who already have temporary status, right, with the exception of essential workers and farm workers, but DACA recipients and TPS recipients already do? So how is this any different than making sure that the individuals who already have temporary status would then be placed on a pathway to citizenship because of the contributions that they've already made? And I want to be clear. I do not buy in to the us versus them debate about who's more deserving and who isn't. I do not buy into that for a second. And the reason that I don't is because even as a DACA recipient, right, I realize that the reason why we have the privilege and the ability to call ourselves DACA recipient is due to the original dreamers, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles who literally paved the way for us to be where we are today. Without them and without their foresight and fortitude, we would not be here, nor would we be able to say that we're dreamers, right? We're the original. No, we're not. No, we're not. We owe a huge a debt of gratitude to the organizers who are now in their 30s and 40s and 50s and are undocumented, but still holding it down, even though this is a pathway to citizenship that wouldn't even benefit them. Can you imagine chaining yourselves to one another on a freeway, locking arms on a freeway, being able to lead a dying in the halls of Congress, and the bill that you're fighting for wouldn't even benefit you? We owe those people a debt of gratitude, right? And so I don't buy into it for that exact reason. I think 11.5 million people, and I will not stop until it's 11.5, because at the end of the day, our fight does not stop when DACA recipients get status. Our fight does not stop when TPS recipients get status. Our fight ends when 11.5 million undocumented people are placed on a pathway to citizenship. And not just that, when we can have people freely migrating in accordance to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which migration is, and being able to do so without the militarization, right, at the border, because it's a fundamental human right for people to migrate. And so let's talk about what the alternatives are. So here's some alternatives. So even though on September 19th, we saw the Senate parliamentarian rule against including immigration reform in the bill, here are the options, right? There's alternatives. Who is the president of the Senate? Kamala Harris, meaning that as the president of the Senate, she has the ability to overrule the Senate parliamentarian and make the decision to include immigration reform in the reconciliation package. Who else? The Senate Majority Leader, who also happens to be a Democrat, Chuck Schumer, also has the ability, because Elizabeth isn't an elected official. Nobody voted for her. That's what I'm saying. You don't even go here. We did not vote, okay? We did not vote for you. What are you doing infringing upon people's right to freely migrate and for people to be able to be placed on a pathway to citizenship? And so that's the alternative. The president of the Senate, Kamala D. Harris, could decide that she wants to overrule her. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, can then say, you know what? You are serving at the pleasure of the Senate Majority Leader. I am not satisfied that you did not want to include immigration. Now, here's the problem. Do we have the backbone to do this? Right? Does the Democratic Party have the backbone to fight for these things, like getting rid of the filibuster, which is prohibiting so many progressive policies from being passed in our nation's Congress? The backbone is what I would say is a major missing puzzle piece in this picture. It's because of a lack of that we do not have access to being able to fight in the way that we want to. So what's next for DACA? So you all remember Judge Hannon, okay, and his foolery in being able to decide against DACA, and he ruled against DACA. And what he basically said was that there were certain parts of deferred action for childhood arrival that wasn't valid, okay? And what he meant by that is that when the executive order for deferred action for childhood arrivals came down, there were two processes that were skipped. So the 60-day public comment period and the legal review of deferred action for childhood arrivals was skipped by the Obama administration. And as a result of that technicality, because that's all it is, it's a technicality, that he decided to rule DACA invalid and therefore make it impossible for new recipients to apply. Problematic. And so what we now have the Department of Homeland Security propose a few days ago, actually maybe a month ago, is that they wanted to recreate DACA. And what that means is that they would recreate DACA exactly as we see it, but instead this time including the 60 days for public comment and legal review, the aspects that the judge claimed was missing, okay? And then do it again the exact same way, the same thing, 2 years that you would have to apply and renew, and then the same criteria, except that they would include these pieces. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the alternatives where we could have Kamala D. Harris overrule, Chuck Schumer dismissing the Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, or we have the Department of Homeland Security who's also recreating DACA. But none of this seems to answer the lingering question. It's not enough for people to survive. We don't want to survive. We don't want to be tragic immigrants. We want to thrive. Okay? I don't know about y'all, but I'm out here trying to thrive. Okay? So it's not enough that we see them wanting to recreate DACA. Okay, that's cute. That's cute. But we need more, because people should not be living their lives on a 2-year by 2-year basis. And for the people who don't have DACA, it's even worse, because there's a privilege, and I recognize that privilege in being a DACA recipient. But we have to fight for the rest of our community too. So this is the next part that I just want you all to have as a takeaway: how you can go ahead and support members of the Haitian community. So on the left is a call to action by the Haitian Bridge Alliance. On the right, they have an Act Blue page that they're asking that if you're able to donate to, if you are able. And I just wanted to leave you with some of the Black immigrant organizations that you could continue. You know, this was just a little appetizer, okay? This wasn't an entree. We just want to whet your appetite a bit to be able to engage further in these conversations. And I hope that I was able to do that with this today. And I look forward to answering any questions or concerns that you all might have. But let me just go ahead and tell you these organizations really quickly. We have ABISA, which is the African Bureau. They do incredible work in, I believe they're in Michigan. African Communities Together, Africans US, the Haitian Bridge Alliance, of course, which has been spearheading much of the work at the border and getting Black migrants out of detention. The Black LGBT Migrant Project, official BLMP, and then of course BAJI, which is the Black Alliance for Just Immigration at Insta. I missed the A, child. I missed the A, but Insta BAJI, and you could revert to them if you're trying to learn more about what's currently going on with immigration, with DACA, with TPS, with DED, and of course, if you would like to learn more specifically about Black immigrants and the disproportional impact of this nation's immigration system, depending on who you are, right? Because of 11.5 million, there's only 619,000 undocumented and Black people that we know of. So these conversations need to happen much more, right? And we need to have conversations about members of the Black community, members of the AAPI community, even white immigrants, right? Like there is white undocumented people out there, y'all. It's just, we call them expats.
How?
You know, so they exist. And, you know, these are the conversations that I think are crucial in order for us to be able to get to a more inclusive space and to have these conversations in a way that could truly be representative of the diversity that we have in this country. So thank you all so much for taking the time to listen. And for the next few minutes, you know, I think Daniela will go ahead and field questions from you all.